capital M, lowercase g, open parentheses, capital O, capital H, close parentheses, and a subscript of 2. When a subscript is outside the parentheses, then every element in those parentheses needs to be multiplied by the subscript outside. So that means this 2 here will multiply the H and the O. So it will look like this: 2 oxygen and hydrogens on each side of magnesium. So even though we only have 3 elements here, we actually have 5 atoms: 2 hydrogen, 2 oxygen, and 1 magnesium. Let's move on to our practice. So day 3 practice, we're going to be using Fe, open parentheses, OH, close parentheses, 3, open parentheses, PO4, close parentheses, 2, C3H5, open parentheses, OH, close parentheses, 3. So remember, our first step is always going to be box the elements and then write them down. Then our second step will be to multiply the subscript outside the parentheses, then all other subscripts. So let's go work on our practice examples. Okay, so let's work on our examples. Our first example is FeOH3. So step 1, let's box the elements. However, since we have parentheses and a subscript, we first have to work with the parentheses. So the number outside the parentheses must be multiplied by everything inside the parentheses. So when we write down our elements, we have iron, and there's no subscript or parentheses, so we know iron is just 1. Our second element is oxygen, and since we have the 3 outside the parentheses, that means there is 3 oxygen atoms. And our third is hydrogen, also has the 3 outside the parentheses. So we end up with 3 elements and 7 atoms. So let's work on example 2. We have those parentheses again. So we're going to have to do 2 steps in this example. That 4 will have to be multiplied by the oxygen before we can move on to the 2 outside the parentheses. So step 1, I'm going to box my elements. I have P, I have O. So when I write them down, phosphorus only has 1 box, but since it's inside those parentheses, you need to multiply that 2 by phosphorus, so you end up with 2 atoms of phosphorus. Then we have our oxygen. Our oxygen has that 4 next to it, so that means that oxygen has 4 atoms. But this is 4 atoms only inside the parentheses. We still need to multiply the 2 also by oxygen, so it would actually be 4 times 2. So our oxygen atoms end up being 8. So for this example, we have 2 elements and 10 atoms. Let's look at example 3. So step 1, we're going to box our elements again. Make sure you get the subscripts in the box. Since there's a subscript outside the parentheses, this is going to be just like example 1. We're going to have to multiply that by both inside. Remember, both hydrogen and carbon have their own subscripts as well. So let's write down our elements. First element was carbon. Carbon had a 3 next to it, so carbon has 3 atoms. Our next step was hydrogen. So we write down hydrogen. However, hydrogen has 5 atoms here, we know because of the subscript, and because of the 3 outside the parentheses, hydrogen has 3 atoms here. So 5 plus 3 is 8 atoms of hydrogen. Our last example is oxygen. We have that 3 outside the parentheses again, so that gives us 3 atoms of oxygen. So we ended up with 3 elements and 14 atoms. Now make sure you've written down all of your examples in your journal under the practice examples.